In previous videos, I've shown you how to create a grid of thumbnails in rows and columns to create a nice gallery. But not all galleries or not all web page layouts are in rows and columns. Some are more freeform. For example, here's a layout that I received from one of my students as a mock-up. And I really like this, how the thumbnails just seem to flow like water. And you can also see there's a bit of depth here with some thumbnails in front of others and some behind. Now this could not be created in a grid. This is much more freeform. Here's another example where all the buttons or links look like real objects. So in this case, the student would create the desktop and set it as the background for the page, and then create each of these as separate PNG images with transparent backgrounds, and then position them in a very free-form way. Now both of these layouts share one thing in common, that they don't have rows and columns for the grid. So this requires a different approach. I'm going to show you in a simple blank page how to create divs in this way and position them. So I start by inserting a div. If all my divs share the same properties such as a border or a drop shadow, then I would give them a class, and then in the class properties I would give all the common attributes, all the common look and feel properties. But in this case I'm not using a class. Since I need to position each of these divs independently, they will need IDs. In your case, if you have specific names for each of those thumbnails, you would write those into the ID. In my case, I'm just doing a quick demo, so I'm just going to call my divs 1, 2, and 3. But you cannot use numbers as a name for a div, as an ID. It has to begin with a letter. So for my div number 1, I'm going to type out the number 1. So here's my div. It's positioned at the top left by default, and it stretches across the page. To change this, first I need to add a selector for this div. So I'm going to select the div, and for this demo I'm not creating a style sheet. I'm just going to define my styles within the HTML page. This is not usually a good practice for a complete website, but for this one-off demo it's okay. In your case, you would create your styles within your style sheet. That's important. So I'm going to add a selector for div number 1. And the most important property for positioning these divs in a free-form way is set the position to absolute. Notice what happens here. Instead of stretching across the whole page, it becomes a small box. If I click on the box, I see this little icon on the top left, which identifies that this div is absolutely positioned. Now I can click and drag this div anywhere on my page. Also, I can click on this corner and resize it, or for that matter, click on any corner and just click and drag to resize my div. Notice what's happening here. Under my position, Dreamweaver is setting a top and a left position. These numbers are the distances from the top of the window and the left of the window. So just by dragging this div around, I'm setting the position. And by resizing the div, I am setting the width and height interactively. To help this div stand out, I'm going to give it a background color. I'll also change the text color. And I'll give it some padding. So here's my div number 1. I can position it anywhere I like. I'm going to add another div now. and give it the name 2. Again, I cannot use numbers for the name, I need to type it out. Once again, add a selector. Set the positioning to absolute. And then you can just click on the div, drag it around, resize it, I'll give it a background color and some padding. So these are my two divs, both are positioned absolutely, and I can even make them overlap like this. And you will notice that the second div I created sits in front of the first div. So every new div that you create is more towards the foreground and the older divs are more towards the background. But I can change this. So each div has a property called zindex. Zindex decides the stacking order of this div. The higher the number, the more towards the foreground. The lower the number, the more it recedes into the background. So for div number 1, if I want to bring it to the foreground, I click on the selector for #1, and under zindex, I set a value of some high number, let's say 10. As you can see, this brings div number 1 in front. Now if I click on div number 2, it appears like it's in front of div number 1, but that's just a temporary preview. If I let go or just click in the background, I see that div number 1 is still in the foreground. If I now want to bring div 2 into the foreground, if I change my mind and this needs to be in front, I need to select the selector for number 2 and set the z-index to something higher than 10, because div number 1 has a z-index of 10. So now, with a value of 15, div number 2 is in front. I'm going to show you a third example of an absolutely positioned div, and in this one I'm going to insert an image. So first I insert a div. I'll just call it 3. Create a selector for it. Set the positioning to absolute. And then inside this div, I'm going to delete all the text and insert an image. Now notice I have not set a width and height for this div, so it's just expanding to accommodate the image. And just like any other absolutely positioned div, I can click and drag to position this div where I want. Now if I want this div to be in front, I need to click on the selector for number 3 and change the z-index to something higher than 15. And there you have it. So using absolute position, I can create a more freeform layout of divs on my page. Some of them can contain text, some can contain images, some can just have a solid color background, and I can use them as a decorative element. There is one more thing I'd like to show you, and that is the positioning of these divs can be done in percentages if you don't want it in pixels. So for example, div number 1, I can set the left position. Notice this is not margin or padding, this is the position. I can change this to, let's say, 50% and set the top value to about 30%. What this does is, since this div is now positioned with percentages, every time I resize the browser window, it adapts to the width of my window. These two are positioned with pixels, not percentages, so they stay in the same place no matter what. But this div is positioned using percentages, so it adapts or it fluidly changes its position based on the width of my browser window. I can do the same for these guys. And for number 3. So now if I resize my window, all of these divs will very fluidly adapt to the widths of my window. So 2 different ways to position your divs in an absolute manner, one using pixels and one using percents. This way you can create more interesting layouts instead of being restricted to rows and columns.